Welcome, everyone. We will give folks just a few minutes to make their way from the waiting room and get started in just a moment. Welcome, welcome. Thank you to everyone who is joining us live for today's Lunch and Learn, Jumpstarting the Maine's offshore wind industry with bold legislation. And thanks to everyone who is watching this recording on YouTube. The timing for today's program could not be better. Just yesterday, environmental and labor advocates for Maine-made offshore wind filled the halls of the State House for Conservation Lobby Day and talked with lawmakers about the remarkable opportunity that Maine has to boost the development of responsibly developed floating offshore wind in the Gulf of Maine. It was such a treat to see so many of you there. Thanks for coming out for Conservation Lobby Day. After Lobby Day, many of us stuck around for the public hearing on LD 1895, a key piece of legislation that would launch an offshore wind industry that Maine can truly be proud of. Maine people have a lot to say about offshore wind, and lawmakers on the Energy, Utilities, and Technology Committee heard more than 5 hours of testimony yesterday. It was a long day for many of you. LD 1895 is also a priority of Maine's Environmental Priorities Coalition, which, as many of you know, includes 37 organizations that are committed to advancing environmental justice, supporting healthy and sustainable communities, protecting our land, water, and wildlife, and taking bold climate action. Along with LD 1818, which would set high environmental and labor standards for a future offshore wind port in Maine, the Offshore Wind Procurement Bill holds equity and environmental protection at its core, with provisions requiring environmental mitigation, ensuring strong labor standards, and fostering inclusive benefits for Maine's most vulnerable communities. Both bills are also the result of a truly groundbreaking coalition, and we are thrilled to welcome 5 phenomenal advocates to share a sneak peek at what they're working on together and how. With us today, I'm going to go through this incredible crew. We've got Kelt Wilska, who is MCV's Energy Justice Manager. Kelt leads the Mainers for Offshore Wind table of the regional New England for Offshore Wind Coalition. And he's going to take us through what that means and how the unusual allies are coming together around this year's legislation and the clean energy transition. We'll also hear from Jack Shapiro, who's the Climate and Clean Energy Director at the Natural Resources Council of Maine. Jack will walk us through the role of offshore wind in meeting Maine's clean energy goals and explain the direction LD 1895 would set for our state. Of course, where we build offshore wind is a key part of that direction. Eliza Donoghue is the Director of Advocacy and Staff Attorney at Maine Audubon, and she'll share how wildlife and conservation biologists are thinking about and shaping the siting of offshore wind in the Gulf of Maine. Siting impacts people as well, and Amy Eshoo, Director of Maine Climate Action Now, is with us to explore how this legislation will benefit the Maine communities bearing the brunt of the climate crisis. A big part of that has to do with the Maine people who will benefit from good, family-sustaining, clean energy jobs. Here to tell us more is Frances Eanes, Executive Director of the Maine Labor Climate Council. What a lineup. Thank you all for being here today, and double, triple thanks for being here after what was a very long day at the State House yesterday. All right, my name is Kathleen Neal. I am the Senior Director of Policy and Partnerships here at Maine Conservation Voters and Maine Conservation Alliance. Our organizations represent more than 13,000 members and supporters, dedicated to protecting Maine's environment and our democracy. MCA does that through education, collaboration, and advocacy, and MCV by influencing public policy, holding politicians accountable, and winning elections. Since 2020, this weekly online Lunch and Learn series has helped us advance all of those goals, creating a shared space to explore Maine's environmental and social history, policy priorities, climate action movement, and more. We're almost ready to dive into today's program, but first, just a reminder, we're going to hear from each of our speakers first and tackle as many questions as possible in the Q&A session at the end. Feel free to send your questions to me through the chat whenever they occur to you, and I'll keep track of them and synthesize those with similar themes and ask as many of them as possible following the presentation. We ask that you not message our speakers directly, as we want their focus on the presentation, not the chat box. If you have any technical difficulties today, you can message Will Sedlak and he will help you out. This event is being recorded and the video will be posted on our website later this afternoon, where you can also find recordings of all of our previous programs, including quite a few on offshore wind. Thank you again for joining us. Kelt, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Kathleen, and thank you everybody for being here today. It's a great day, coming off of a long day yesterday, but we are feeling energized and ready to make offshore wind happen in the Gulf of Maine. So thank you very much. My name is Kelt Wilska, and I'm the Energy Justice Manager at Maine Conservation Voters. I also serve as the Maine State Lead on behalf of MCV for the New England for Offshore Wind Coalition, a regional coalition of environmental, labor, educational, and business organizations, all committed to advocating for responsible offshore wind development off the coast of New England. At the state level, I facilitate the Mainers for Offshore Wind Coalition, and I'm joined by 4 of my fabulous friends, colleagues, and coalition partners today to talk about 2 pieces of legislation that are going to jumpstart the commercial offshore wind industry in the Gulf of Maine. And before I do so and pass it over to each one of my colleagues to talk about their respective issue areas in these pieces of legislation, I just want to zoom out for a second from a coalition perspective and talk about how much time has gone into this legislation. Many, many months of collaboration have happened between environmental and labor and fisheries stakeholders to make this legislation what it is today. We're going to make offshore wind happen in the Gulf of Maine the Maine way, with provisions for environmental monitoring and mitigation, labor protections, community benefits, and making sure that this electricity is affordable for all Mainers. So the one word I want to really frame this conversation with today is intersectional. And what do I mean by intersectional? I mean when multiple issue areas that are complementary come together in pursuit of a common goal, in pursuit of a common equitable goal. And so with that, I'm going to now pass it over to our first coalition member today, who's also been leading the bill as it stands today, our bill lead, Jack Shapiro from the Natural Resources Council of Maine. Jack's going to be talking about affordable electricity for all Mainers and how offshore wind can make that happen. So Jack, I'll pass it over to you and I'll get the slides up and running. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Kelt. And hi, everybody. Great to be with you today. As Kelt said, many of us were at the State House till about 9 or so last night, wrapping up the big hearing on offshore wind. But it's a privilege to be there doing this kind of work on such an important issue. So I'll just start rolling in there, Kelt. Just whenever the slides come up, just go for it. But I think the overall context here, of course, is that we're trying to address the climate crisis here in Maine. Climate is already affecting Maine. It's affecting some of our iconic industries like fishing, like winter sports. All of these, we're already seeing a lot of these impacts, and the Gulf of Maine is warming, as we've heard, over and over, faster than 99% of the world's oceans. Maine has taken some pretty decisive legislative action. We've set renewable energy and greenhouse gas reduction targets. And the state has created the Maine Climate Council and come up with a comprehensive climate plan in 2020. Maine won't wait. And the sort of spine of that plan is electrification. And what that means, you can go to the next slide. What that really means is switching our energy use to electricity in all of the sources that are currently powered by fossil fuels. So that includes power generation, but it also includes how we heat our homes and businesses, how we fuel our cars and trucks. And this has huge benefits beyond climate. It gives us better price stability. These are often much more efficient appliances, so it comes with operational energy savings. It reduces pollution and health impacts. But critically, all of this new electric load needs to be served by new clean and renewable energy sources. And that is where offshore wind really comes in. And you can go to the next slide. So all of this electrification is likely going to double the electricity needs that we have as a state. And really, because this core strategy of electrification is something that's taking place all across New England and is also embodied in the Inflation Reduction Act, the big piece of climate legislation that passed in Congress last year, we're going to need a lot of new renewable energy to serve that load everywhere. And it has to be renewable. Otherwise, we're just going to be keeping these fossil fuel plants operating in Maine and across the country. But wind is also, and offshore wind in particular, is also a really great source of energy for this because it complements solar. Solar runs most during the day and in the summer. Wind peaks mostly at night and in the winter. So that means that that diverse portfolio of renewables helps lower the overall cost of this big transition in our power sector. The other really important dynamic that offshore wind brings is price stability. The energy cost increases that we've seen in Maine and elsewhere in New England have really been driven by our dependence on fossil fuels. It's high heating oil prices, it's high gas prices at the pump, and it's pushing up electricity bills. Renewable energy, like offshore wind, doesn't have any fuel costs. So those costs don't go up and down with global fossil fuel markets. You get a stable contracted price over the life of the project, which really reduces that volatility, which is so harmful, especially for people with high energy burdens, low income folks, seniors, and things like that. And you can go to the next slide. So fortunately, years of work have gone into setting the stage for offshore wind development in Maine. The University of Maine has been working on this technology now for decades. There's a demonstration turbine and a research array in federal waters that are in the works. And Maine just concluded the offshore wind roadmap process, which was a big multi-year stakeholder process run by the governor's energy office, really making the point that floating offshore wind development in the Gulf of Maine goes way beyond energy and climate. It's also one of the biggest economic development opportunities that we're going to see for a generation or more. The other really key point about timing here is that the federal government is going to be offering commercial wind leases next year. So now is really the time to act, and why it's so important that we have brought forward LD 1895 this year and are working to get it passed. Next slide. So what LD 1895 is designed to do is to jumpstart this new industry for Maine. We have a broad coalition that we're really proud of that Kelt mentioned a little bit about. We've been working on this for months, really since last fall, and trying to really build on that roadmap process. So the key provisions in the bill are setting this schedule of competitive procurements. That is a commitment from the state to buy offshore wind power and ask developers to give us the best prices for that wind power. We're requiring these plans from developers that help us ensure that this wind is developed in federal waters at high standards. And that's for labor, for the environment and equity, for community benefits, and for fishing interests. And it also includes some key things around regional collaboration and transmission, other things that are going to help us keep costs as low as possible as we build out this new industry and reap all of the economic benefits that are going to come along with that. So I'll stop there. I know some of my colleagues are going to talk about some of the other key provisions in the bill, but really this bill is our chance to build a brand new homegrown clean energy resource that Maine can be really proud of, and is really part of building the clean energy future that Maine deserves, while protecting all the resources that we have as a state for future generations. So I guess, pass it back to you, Kelt.
Thank you so much, Jack. Fantastic. Okay, so we were just talking about renewable, homegrown, and affordable electricity. Now let's take it over to Eliza Donoghue at Maine Audubon, who's going to talk about how we can get this renewable, affordable, homegrown electricity done the responsible way in the Gulf of Maine. So Eliza, I'm going to pass it over to you now. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks so much, Kelt, and thanks everyone for being here. It's truly a pleasure, even though so many of us were up so late last night in Augusta, to be here and to be sharing what is truly one of the most exciting things that I've worked on professionally, and frankly will be probably working on the rest of my professional life, and that is offshore wind development, and specifically floating offshore wind development. So Maine Audubon, which I represent as the Director of Advocacy and Staff Attorney, we are a really strong supporter of offshore wind development in the Gulf of Maine. And we come to this bill and have brought our resources, our time and attention because we see it as our opportunity in using Maine-based policy to secure environmental standards and to minimize impacts to wildlife in the marine environment, while at the same time securing the climate and clean energy benefits of offshore wind. You know, I say this time and again, but climate change is truly the biggest threat to Maine's wildlife, and we are interested in the many strategies, policy and otherwise, that it will take for us to achieve both Maine and the nation's climate and clean energy goals. And as an organization, and we are joined by so many of our friends and colleagues in the wildlife conservation sphere, we are really confident that offshore wind can coexist with wildlife in the Gulf of Maine, and as well coexist with the marine environments that they rely on. Our confidence, it comes from a lot of different sources. You know, most notably, it's based in the 30 years of offshore wind development that has occurred in Europe. There is a lot that can be learned there, real world lessons, associated best practices. You know, a recent study of seabird behavior over a period of 2 years on a project off the east coast of Scotland. They used radar combined with cameras, and they did not detect a single collision with seabirds. It's really good news. Of course, coast of Scotland's very different than Maine, but more to say on that in a minute. We're also really confident because we've heard specifically from offshore wind developers. They've indicated to the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, that's the federal entity that is in charge with leasing wind energy areas, that they don't want to locate projects closer than 20 miles from the coast of Maine or from Maine Islands. That's great news for birds. That means that these projects are going to be located outside of the areas that are most frequently used by migratory birds and foraging seabirds. And so, of course, I led with the fact that we're confident, but we're also remaining diligent. You know, a great deal more needs to be understood about how wildlife and floating offshore wind development in the Gulf of Maine can coexist. And we feel that LD 1895, the bill that we're talking about today, is an excellent opportunity to facilitate that learning while setting Maine-based environmental standards. So briefly, I'm just going to tick through kind of the elements of the bill that specifically relate to wildlife and wildlife habitat. I think next slide now, Kelt, thank you. So the first one is requiring that $10 million per megawatt goes to research, monitoring, and conservation. This is an amount, it's a good amount of money that is on par with what our friends in New York and New Jersey have already established in policy. Next slide. That funding would flow to the Maine Offshore Wind Research Consortium. That consortium is an existing entity composed of Maine-based fisheries and natural resource stakeholders, commercial fishermen, non-commercial folks with expertise in non-commercial fisheries, folks with expertise in avian species, marine mammals, representatives from Maine's natural resource agencies, and they've been tasked with establishing a research strategy to identify both the opportunities and the challenges caused by the deployment of offshore wind projects. Advanced slide, please. We've also required in the bill, or the bill also requires that all bids include a mitigation plan for impacts to wildlife, fisheries, and the marine environment. And those plans must include detailed descriptions of management practices based on best available science that will be employed to avoid, minimize, and mitigate to impacts to threatened and endangered species, commercial fisheries, coastal ecosystems, and more. And then last slide, please. And then finally, when the state is assessing projects that are bidding in to sell their energy to Maine, we've constructed the bill so that projects that go above and beyond the standard mitigation plan and funding requirements, that they're rewarded for going above and beyond. Projects that support additional efforts to monitor environmental impacts, etc. We included these provisions because we know that this is an area of concern to Maine people, and it's important that our policies reflect the concerns and the desires of the folks who are going to be benefiting from this clean energy. And I am excited that I've heard robust support from legislators, from the administration, et cetera, so far for these elements of the plan, because again, they reflect the values of Maine people and will help Maine feel really good about the power that they are purchasing. And I'll end it at that and maybe encourage questions at the end on what's happening at the federal level to make sure that these projects are going being located in the right place.
Thank you so much, Eliza. So, responsible offshore wind development in the Gulf of Maine, making sure it's done responsibly and that we can fight climate change while also protecting our ocean ecosystems. Let's turn it over to Amy Eshoo now, who's been working very hard to ensure that offshore wind is also done equitably and that the economic benefits of this booming industry, it's happening right now, are felt throughout the entire state, not only just on our coastal communities, but also in our very most rural inland communities as well. So Amy, I'm going to pass it over to you, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Kelt. You can start my slides anytime. I'm Amy Eshoo, Director of Maine Climate Action Now, a statewide coalition of grassroots organizations, and I collaborated with this team on diversity, equity, and inclusion pieces which are woven throughout the bill. The bill calls for a diversity, equity, inclusion plan. Some people call that DEI for short, and a consultation, engagement, and community benefit plan in the developer's bids. So the Governor's Energy Office and the Public Utilities Commission will evaluate these plans as part of the process in choosing the developer who will build offshore wind for Maine. Next slide, please. An obligation of energy procurement and development of this size is that no community is left behind. Unlike past dirty energy systems and investments where communities were adversely impacted and overburdened by the industries, or the underserved where not everyone had the opportunity to be in the workforce or to benefit economically. Next slide, please. The bid requirements include standards set in the DEI plan, which has provisions for workforce, for supplier and investor diversity, meaning that across the board, Mainers would have opportunities to take part in the growth of this new economy. Next slide, please. The Governor's Energy Office and the Public Utilities Commission will evaluate the bids in favor of those supplying a plan for ongoing investment in community benefits and economic development, including for Maine's environmental justice populations, federally recognized tribes, commercial and recreational fishing industries, fishing communities, and other impacted stakeholders. When we set such standards, it incentivizes the developers to include these plans in their bids, ensuring that offshore wind benefits all of us. Next slide, please. I just want to include a definition because you will hear often in this work, environmental justice population. I'll let you read that. Next slide, please. The bill asks developers to include employment and contracting opportunities for certified businesses located in the state for Maine residents and residents of the state who might be members of federally recognized tribes or environmental justice populations, minorities, women, veterans, LGBTQIA+ persons, persons with disabilities, individuals with formal involvement in the criminal justice system. Next slide, please. And it encourages the hiring of members of these groups and communities as employees in the design, construction, operation, and maintenance of floating offshore wind, including workers in industries directly affected by the development of offshore wind, such as those in the fossil fuel industry or the commercial fishing industry. So you can see it is a wide range of folks that we are hoping will have the chance to join in this process. Next slide, please. Also, as Jack outlined, there are benefits to ratepayers. We'll have reductions in energy supply costs. There's long-term cost effectiveness compared to other generation options to reach our goals, our emission reduction goals. Electricity cost stability and avoidance of price volatility, such as we all know from like natural gas and oil. Increased electric grid resiliency and reliability. Avoided transmission and grid infrastructure costs to Maine ratepayers through the use of shared or regional transmission. Starting a new industry gives us all these opportunities. There will also be benefits targeted to low-income ratepayers as determined by the Commission. Next slide, please. And as I said before, there is a plan for consultation, stakeholder engagement, and community benefits, with ongoing investment in community benefits, with a stated annual target rate of investment or total investment. In order to decide what the community benefits are, we've asked for meaningful consultation with identified groups, communities that we outlined. In order to ensure that it's not just checking the box, we ask that it includes how the responsible entity, the bidder, the developer, will identify and fulfill goals and desired community and economic benefits developed through a collective understanding of shared interests for each group. It calls for them to commit to identify, incorporate, and respond to the diverse perspectives, needs, and concerns of stakeholders. There's an incentive for the bidders to describe their meaningful stakeholder engagement plans. You can see there's a lot of carrots in this bill for the developers to do the right thing. Engagement ensures that everyone participates from the beginning and throughout the process in more than just meetings. They're part of the process and part of the solution. Next slide, please. To achieve a transition to clean, renewable offshore wind energy on this scale needs everyone to have a vested interest across the state. We've seen other states have successfully set these same high standards into law, and note that it's becoming accepted by developers as common practice. Next slide, please. I look forward to being a part of this, as I hope you will too. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. So much benefit to be derived from this industry. So many communities stand to benefit from this industry across the state, including our most vulnerable communities. And speaking of benefits, let's talk about who's going to be making these turbines, who's going to be putting them in the water, who's going to be assembling, manufacturing all the parts, putting them together. With that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Frances Eanes from the Maine Labor Climate Council, who's going to be talking about not only this bill, LD 1895, but also the Ports Bill, and which is just an extremely critical piece of the puzzle here. We see them in tandem, working together to making sure that offshore wind happens in the Gulf of Maine, making sure that we have a port where we can build these things so we can put them in the ocean. So Frances is going to talk about who we want to be building these turbines and how that's going to happen. So Frances, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kelt, and great to be with you all today. I really enjoyed the lunch and learn I did back in September for those of you who were on the call then. And I apologize if there are any misspellings in my slides. I've been without childcare this week and it's been nutty, and I've been glad just to get a matching pair of socks on. So with that said, delighted to be here. Just a quick framing before I jump into the specifics of this procurement bill and of course the companion ports bill is that, as Amy alluded to, this commitment to a just transition, which I know is something that's come up today and is like very common and importantly part of any thoughtful intellectual discussion about climate change. We don't have a lot of good track records of just transitions across lots of domains, including energy. And I just want to note that the labor movement has been one piece of that. And there's lots of good reasons why on other issues, even in this legislative session right now here in Maine, we're on the other side of issues. And so I'm super proud of the work that we've done together as this coalition on these bills and beyond, because I think it's one thing to talk about a just transition. It's another thing to actually put it into practice in something very real and tangible. And these bills do that. And I think this is the long game here, right? Not the super long game, because we do have to act quickly, but this is the long game, especially with offshore wind, especially here in Maine. And for us to have credibility to go back to our union members and those who aren't yet even in this industry and say, look, here's a reason why you should come join and get into the fight to make this industry happen. When we build in labor standards at the beginning and talk about job quality, we actually do then bring people along in a really productive way. So with that framing, I want to just quickly run through a few key elements of both the procurement and ports legislation from a labor standpoint, but these really do overlap very strongly with the DEI components that Amy talked about, and frankly, with the environment and fisheries pieces as well, because how these turbines get built, the skill, the safety, all of these things don't stay in the world of labor. They absolutely matter to workers, but we don't want to have turbines falling apart because they're done in a shoddy way, right? We don't want, that's not good for the ocean environment. And there's all kinds of opportunity in terms of who is benefiting from the jobs from a DEI perspective if we do this right. So real quick here, the two pieces of legislation require, in the case of ports, or strongly incentivize in the case of the procurement bill, project labor agreements for construction work and labor peace agreements for operation, maintenance, and maritime job. The quick distinction there is PLAs apply to temporary work like construction, labor peace applies to permanent jobs. And I'll say more about what those agreements are in just a minute. But what else these bills do? They require developers to show how they are giving preference to the hiring of Maine workers and members of communities overlooked and left behind, many of whom Amy described, in other energy economies in the past and ongoing today, right? We want to actually forge a different path here. They also require developers to show how they are investing in workforce development. The two clear ways is registered apprenticeship and registered pre-apprenticeship. And what those models of workforce training do is bring people who have zero experience on the tools in the trades, in some cases from a halfway house where they are leaving formal involvement in the criminal justice system, and get them job experience with a qualified, experienced journey person, and in some cases, as an electrician, through a 4-year training program, right, with on-the-job learning, where they can earn while they learn, and become a really productive member of the construction industry. And then, of course, what these bills are really doing is also requiring developers to show how they are giving preference to workers who might be displaced by or in some ways affected by the development of offshore wind. The most obvious ones that come to mind here are those who work in fossil fuels, whether it's caring for the tank farms in South Portland, or who work laying natural gas pipe, right? But certainly we can imagine, and we have seen down south, there are opportunities for those who make their living on the water to still fish, right? We don't want to put anyone out of work on the water, but to also pick up extra shifts, shuttling people or supplies out to offshore wind crews. That's an opportunity for extra income. Next slide, please. So what are PLAs and labor peace agreements? At their core, PLAs are pre-hire agreements. So before a construction project starts, that ensures on-time and on-budget completion. And these are particularly used and useful for large and complex construction projects and can contain a number of common elements. And just to give you context, PLAs have existed since the 1930s. They are a well-used practice in the construction industry across all states, red and blue. And typically, again, for large multi-tens or hundreds of millions or billion-dollar projects, they are very common for this. What do they do and how do they achieve on time and on budget completion? This is not just me shilling for them, right? They coordinate shifts and schedules across 20 or more different trades and crafts who might have their own collective bargaining agreement, multiple subcontractors. We need coordination if we want to have the climate crisis dealt with at speed and scale. They provide developers of projects certainty around labor costs upfront, right? That's super helpful at the bidding stage for our PUC. They also provide accountability and some real teeth and even more ambitious opportunity around DEI and local hire commitments than can be done in statute. And that's more to say about the limitations of federal and state law when it comes to DEI around quotas or around local hire commitments. But since PLAs are private agreements, they can go farther and they have real teeth and binding arbitration if these standards and commitments from project developers are not met. So it's really where the rubber hits the road for at least one part of DEI and making sure that Mainers are benefiting from this industry. They also require developers to really put real resources into workforce development, registered apprenticeship and a pre-apprenticeship, both on the training and on the on-the-job learning and experience opportunities, so that we can have a continually fully fleshed out pipeline of workers over their lifespan. And then they also contain no strike and no lockout clauses to ensure the smooth completion of a project. And this is especially critical given the nature of the work that we're talking about, right? If we are serious about addressing climate change in a scientifically rigorous way, we do want to have continuous work, right? That is not interrupted by employers locking out employees or vice versa. And then labor peace agreements, they vary, but at their core, they are commitments that employers or project developers give workers a free and fair chance to join a union by remaining neutral during union organizing campaigns. This sounds absurd that in 2023, we would need to talk about this. We don't expect anything less than this when it comes to our own voting or democratic elections in any other place, but 75 years of real assaults on labor law mean that your democratic rights and your free speech rights often end once you walk into the workplace. And that is a reason why labor peace agreements are so important. And having been through a union organizing drive myself and seen what an employer can do, both legally and illegally, to sow disinformation and fear and mistrust among workers, these are actually really helpful tools that, again, can foster real workplace harmony and get people up to speed on jobs as big and complex as offshore wind. It's the right thing to do, and from a job and effectiveness standpoint, that also a really good tool. Next slide, please. Why do these matter? I've hinted at this a little bit already in my remarks, but if you have a $3 billion project with many subcontractors and in some cases thousands of workers in multiple crafts coming from all over the state and perhaps beyond, you really do need coordination. And PLAs are sometimes considered like a constitution for a work site, right? They provide the rules of the road, that predictability, that framework to really make sure a project happens as efficiently and effectively as possible, which I think we all agree is important. And it means that we have good budget and savings on these projects. No fewer cost overruns under PLAs. And then they also provide that certainty for labor unions who train their own workforce to invest in and ramp up that training infrastructure, right? More than half of the registered apprenticeship graduates in the state of Maine come from labor unions, come from our building trades, right? And when we know in 2023 or 2024, when this procurement bill starts going into effect, that projects starting in 2030 or 2031 will be done under these standards, that gives us a really helpful runway to go out and recruit staff, train, make sure those folks have the OSHA 10 certifications, the Global Wind Organization training, have experience on earlier projects like the research array, right? This gives us that opportunity to really ladder up, get folks ready for commercial scale wind before projects happen. That's in everybody's interest. And then it's worth noting that these kinds of agreements, both PLAs and labor peace, are becoming an industry standard. And we've seen developers like Ørsted voluntarily enter into commitments at the national level. I think Ørsted and the national building trades have an agreement for 6 gigawatts, excuse me, of offshore wind that'll happen in the US under project labor agreements, right? I think everyone understands that this is a really helpful model to make sure we have the workforce supplied and skilled up and ready to move on these projects. Whether you are a true believer or think this is the right thing to do or not, having labor peace agreements and project labor agreements in statute in the case of Maine, especially when it comes to the build out of really expensive and necessary port facilities, this is actually a really helpful framework to attract and maximize federal funding coming in for projects like this, both for a tax credit standpoint from a developer's point of view, but especially from a port building point of view. And this is because of the infrastructure bill and the Inflation Reduction Act and how those are being implemented at the federal level, not because of what I want, but because of how the Biden administration has set this up. And then finally, higher levels of training and experience, which we know on average is going to be greater in union labor, also means higher productivity, right? We can build turbines and foundations faster over the same period of time than with other models. And then doing more on DEI and local hire, it is really helpful through PLAs. And we've seen this in the Vineyard Wind Project labor agreement, and we're starting to see it again in agreements down in New York and New Jersey. You can really go further than what can be accomplished in statute. And then to kind of zoom back out for just a moment, back to where I started, we have both an opportunity and an obligation to tackle not just the climate crisis, but 50, 60, 70 years of inequality. And we have to do it at the same time. And passing bills like 1895 and 1818 are absolutely ways to do it, right? We can have a green economy that is as or more unequal than the one we live in now. And I think we all agree the inequality is at unacceptable levels. Or we can build in strong commitments on DEI, labor equity from the ground up and start to reverse what all of us agree is a crisis. We can and we must do both at the same time. And then finally, and this is speaking just from what I've seen even in the last few weeks, and any of you who were at the ports public hearing or at the procurement hearing last night, understand that when we have commitments up front, whether it's labor or equity or environment, we bring the full power of our organizations to bear, not just to pass legislation, but to help make projects happen, right? We need working people of all kinds saying yes and not staying on the sidelines, and certainly not saying no. And when we build in these good job quality commitments up front, I can go back to my business managers and business agents in our local union affiliates and say, listen, like this is really exciting. And you can go in front of your membership with credibility and tell them why they need to come knock doors in Searsport to help us build a port, as an example. We're so excited to do this. We're proud to do this together with all of you. And we have a long ways to go, but I'm really excited about the position we're in on both of these bills. And just Kelt, if you want to briefly go to the last slide here, this is an example of some of our members who were up last week saying support ports. Like there is so much opportunity to get the 40,000 Maine union members off of the sidelines into the fight. These are just a few of them who are up. We want to keep doing this work. Passing bills like this means we can do more of it. And finally, last slide, Kelt. I know there's a much bigger question around where port facilities should go, but regardless of where that is, the ports bill that I've referenced a number of times, LD 1818, does not weigh in on that question of where a port should go, but says, what should a 21st century port look like? And it has some really important labor, environmental, clean air, clean technology, equipment, incentives, and standards to both help us attract the federal funding that we need for a port, but also to help provide important carrots for, frankly, what is going to be a challenge in any community where this port is. This is a big infrastructure project, and we need to make sure that we can have the smallest impact as possible. And this bill puts us on that right path. I'll leave it there, but thank you all.
Thank you, Francis. Such exciting things to come here. And I'm going to zoom back again. And before I pass it over to Kathleen, I just want to say thank you, Francis. Thank you, Eliza. Thank you, Jack. Thank you, Amy, for your contributions to this groundbreaking bill and to the ports bill as well. And also your contributions to this unprecedented coalition of environmental and labor groups. It really is unprecedented, and we're making change every day. Before I pass it over to Kathleen, I hope that all of you in the audience today have seen the degree to which this bill and these bills are truly intersectional. The equity provisions overlapping with the low-income ratepayer provisions of the energy section, the workforce diversity plan overlapping with the labor provisions of the procurement bill, the responsible overlapping with the equitable. All of these things come together, and these bills get offshore wind done the Maine way. It's all about looking out for our neighbors here. It's looking out for our environment, looking out for our low-income ratepayers, looking out for our most vulnerable communities, and looking out for our working families. Let's get it done. This is really exciting, and these bills will make that happen. So thank you all again, and I'm going to pass it over to Kathleen.
Now it's my turn to say thank you. Thank you to Kelt and Jack and Eliza and Amy and Francis and everybody who you're representing, because you really have brought together just an absolutely astounding coalition of folks, including many of the people on this call. So thanks to all of you for being in this. It's a really exciting moment. We've spent a lot of time in Maine and beyond talking about the goals of the clean energy transition and the targets of electrification and decarbonization. And it is just so exciting to be in this moment where we're actually talking about what that looks like and what that means for Maine people. So thank you all. Thanks to everybody who put in a ton of great questions in the chat. I really appreciate them. And I know we're not going to get close. So keep an eye out for a follow-up email later this afternoon. You will find in that email fact sheets on both of the bills we've talked about today, both the procurement bill and the ports bill. You'll also find a link to sign a petition that lets your lawmakers know, lets all lawmakers know that you're supporting Maine-made offshore wind. There'll also be a link to sign up for a really special storytelling workshop that we're hosting next week, next Thursday evening, to help you figure out how you want to tell your story, write some letters to the editor. That'll be a lot of fun. So you'll get all of that information this afternoon, as well as links to a whole bunch of other offshore wind lunch and learns that we've done through the days and months and years. Really quickly, top level, it was a long day yesterday. How did the hearing go? What are your big takeaways? And I know you're all still processing, but give us a sneak peek. And I'm just throwing that out there, and I'm going to let you fight over who unmutes the first.
I can go. So I think the hearing went pretty well. I think many of the things we heard are things that we expected. there's Francis can probably talk a little bit more about that, but there's some non-union construction companies that are very unhappy that there's labor standards in this bill. There's and I think there's a whole bunch of sort of technical issues about the evaluation of the bids and sort of how that's going to work and how things are weighted and the definitions in the plans and things like that. But I think, you know, the bill that was heard yesterday isn't going to be the one that finally gets signed. There's going to be some more changes that get made, but we're going to be making sure that we're working with other stakeholders in the administration to come to something that we can all agree on that captures the spirit and the intent and the goals of everything that we've talked about today. And I think based on the hearing, we can feel really good about that.
Thanks, Jack, and thanks for being there until the wee hours last night, so that you could give us that recap. Another sort of high level question before we get into some more specific ones. How is offshore wind in Maine going to be different from the offshore wind that's already in operation in Europe? Can you all just give us that quick differentiation? Or will it not be different?
I'm happy to kick that one off. So the biggest difference between offshore wind that will be located in the Gulf of Maine and the majority, though not all, of the offshore wind that has been developed in Europe, primarily in the North Sea, is that offshore wind in Maine will be floating technology as opposed to fixed bottom technology. Fixed bottom is, I guess most crudely stated is, a pile driven into the seabed, whereas floating technology, maybe we can get Jack to show everybody his t-shirt. And though I'm sure actually we had some good, there we go. There were some good slides before. The reason why we have floating technology in the Gulf of Maine is the Gulf of Maine is really deep, too deep for us to do fixed bottom. But because of the Gulf of Maine's proximity to population centers, Gulf of Maine isn't just Maine, it's Massachusetts, it's New Hampshire, it connects to the entirety of the ISO New England grid. It's very much worth locating projects in the Gulf of Maine. And even more so than that, the wind speeds in Maine are amongst the best in the world, let alone in the US. So that's the biggest difference, floating offshore wind versus fixed, though floating offshore wind, there are, I think, 4 existing floating projects in the world. Somebody's going to have to correct me, but I think Portugal, Norway, and I'd have to rack my brain for the other countries. But there are many other countries as well, in addition to the US, that are actively pursuing floating offshore wind as well.
Thanks, Eliza. Yes, Scotland is another one. Thanks, Francis, for putting that in the chat. And Eliza, let's stick with you for a second, because you mentioned some numbers that I'm going to ask you to clarify. What were the funding numbers for wildlife fisheries and habitat, and what did they mean?
Yeah, so I mentioned $10,000 per megawatt, and that's the money that would flow to the Maine Offshore Wind Research Consortium. So what that means is that for every megawatt of power that a project produces, they would be responsible for $10,000 that would flow to that research consortium. What, for those of you who are as poor at mental math as I am, that amounts to, because we're calling for about, or at least 2,800 megawatts in this procurement, that means, oh man, public math, almost $30 million that would flow to research for offshore wind.
Thank you. I appreciate you doing that mental math for us. Gold star. Francis, a question for you. Would LD 1895, or how would LD 1895 help ease the transition for workers in Maine who are in fossil fuel energy infrastructure right now? Or, how are we going to help make sure that we've got folks ready to do this work and trained, both coming up from, out of our community colleges and training programs, but also folks who are already in the workforce who may be looking at retraining?
It's a great question. So I'll take the second one first. For folks who are already in the workforce, who might be, as I said in my presentation, laying natural gas pipe, right, just for distribution lines. This exists in Maine. This is a common source of fossil fuel employment in our state. That skill set, whether you're operating a backhoe, whether you are soldering as a welder, whether you are a pipe fitter, all of these have like close to one-to-one or very close, near-term one-to-one analogs in the offshore wind industry at some point. Maybe not the numbers, like the actual numbers of pipe fitters might be less in offshore wind, but from a skill standpoint, the number of trades and crafts in offshore wind actually does overlap quite a bit with elements of the construction industry who currently work in fossil fuels in Maine. So there's an opportunity with the skill set that already exists to transition. That's one piece. On the maritime side, there's a tremendous amount of maritime skills, and we have partnerships that we are developing with Maine Maritime Academy to get some of their students time at sea with some of our maritime unions. There also are, of course, like outside of Maine Maritime, plenty of folks with maritime experience in our fishing communities and beyond that absolutely can work in this industry, whether it's their full-time or supplementary way. And then on the operation and maintenance side, there are definitely like plant operators at Cousins Island, right? The peaking plant. If in the future, and I have no foreknowledge of this, that plant were to at some point no longer be necessary for any number of reasons, offshore wind or something else, the operators who make a really good living there and our IBEW 1837 members would be preferenced to work in the offshore wind industry as operators of offshore wind farms. So there's all kinds of skill sets. We have a lot of work to do to really map those out. But what this bill does, is actually require developers to work with existing employers in unions specifically to actually try and find those opportunities for partnership so that we can get this done right.
That is really encouraging news about that overlap in skills and just that you're thinking about all of this. Thank you. We are coming up against the top of the hour, but I would be remiss if I didn't ask you all to clarify one more time. Do either of these bills, the procurement or the ports bill, specify where the offshore wind would be where the port would be sited, where the traffic would be? I know we've got a lot of questions and we're not going to have time to get into the details of siting, but I want to just be clear about these bills and what they do.
I can
take that. The easy answer is no, and that's very intentional. There is a process underway with the Maine Department of Transportation and the Governor's Energy Office and the GOPIF to actually deliberatively go through a site selection process. It's also partly up to the federal government. So no, we are not touching any of that with these bills. That's for very good reasons, and it's a really important issue that we all need to be engaged with.
I
perhaps put a finer point on that with relation to the broader offshore wind bill. The basis of that bill is a procurement. This is about Maine purchasing energy. And so that's a very specific process. And you purchase energy from turbines. You don't purchase them through the ports. So it's a real mismatch of issues to be talking about port siting in this offshore wind bill, which has at its heart, it's about purchasing energy.
Yeah, if one other thing, and obviously siting is such an important issue that everyone wants to jump in and talk about it, but just one other thing to add about the siting of the projects, the wind projects specifically, not the port, but for the wind project specifically, that's fully under the jurisdiction of the federal government. They will decide this year for leases that will be offered for sale next year, what sites they will offer for a lease. So that is also a very high stakes decision that the federal government will make. We, as the state of Maine, do not have control over that process, but we do include in this bill incentives to site projects outside of federal lobster management area 1, which is sort of the key footprint of Maine's fishing industry. And that is an important negotiation that we engaged in with a number of members of the fishing community. And essentially, we want to try and minimize that impact to the industry. So while we can't require, we can't say the federal government will not lease projects in any given place, we can say that we prefer projects that are not that are outside of that area that don't conflict. So that's another, I think, important and somewhat nuanced, point to make about citing.
I think important and nuanced could probably be the tagline for all of the offshore wind conversations happening in the state. We clearly are not, we're scratching the surface on the whole body of offshore wind discussions, but really, really grateful for the deep dive on these two particular pieces of legislation. If you weren't taking notes, I don't blame you. You will get a follow-up email later this afternoon with the LD numbers for the two bills we discussed, links to the state legislature's website where you can find the full text of those bills, and a couple of ways that you can take action. It is a fool's errand to predict the schedule and the workings of the Maine legislature, but as of this moment, we expect the Energy Committee to be taking a look and rolling up their sleeves on the procurement bill on Wednesday. You can count on this group to keep you posted on how that goes and how you can get involved. If we didn't get a chance to answer your questions today, please send them to me by email. When you get that follow-up email, you can just hit reply and I will make sure they get to the person best positioned to answer them. Thanks to all of you. You are rock stars. This is our last Lunch and Learn for the month of May, but you will find a June lineup in your inboxes soon, and I hope to see you then. Thank you all so much. Have a great weekend.